Welcome everyone to this webinar titled Someday is Here, ArchivesSpace Projects for Working from Home. I'm Jessica Crouch, the Community Engagement Coordinator for ArchivesSpace, and I'm joined today by Marcella Huggard and Miloche Kottman of the University of Kansas Libraries. In this webinar, Marcella and Miloche will discuss projects they have created for staff in the Cataloging and Archival Processing Department to work on while sheltering in place at home. These cleanup projects, which are often lower priority before the COVID-19 pandemic sent everyone home, include fixing subject and agent records, creating MARC records for legacy manuscript collections, consolidating resource records that were separated, converting PDFs to be archival object inventories in ArchivesSpace, and creating resource records for legacy process collections. Miloche and Marcella will discuss database queries to cull the necessary data and workflows for managing these projects. Marcella Huggard is the manuscripts processing coordinator at the Kenneth Spencer Research Library, part of the University of Kansas Libraries. She oversees arrangement, description, and processing for all of Spencer's manuscript collections and has been with KU since 2015. Miloche Kottman is the head of cataloging and archival processing. In addition to overseeing a staff of 28 full-time members, she is the system administrator for Voyager, Aeon, and ArchivesSpace. She received her MLIS from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We will hold all questions until the Q&A session at the end, though you can type a question into the Q&A panel at any time. We do ask that you type your question into the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen and not the chat option. And with that, I'll welcome Marcella and Miloche. And Miloche, if you'll start us off.
So welcome to our presentation, Someday is Here, ArchivesSpace Projects for Working from Home. I'm Miloche Kottman, the head of cataloging and archival processing at the University of Kansas Libraries, and I'll present the first half of this slideshow, and Marcella Huggard, our manuscripts coordinator, will do the second half. A little bit about us. Kenneth Spencer Research Library was built in 1968 to house the University of Kansas special collections, which include the Regional History Collection, University Archives, and a broad set of special collections. However, KU Libraries had already been collecting regional history and special collections well before the building was built. Cataloging and archival processing is an administratively separate department within KU Libraries with 29 full-time staff and numerous student employees. 11 of the department's staff members perform all or some portion of their cataloging and processing work within Spencer. Like with many institutions of higher education, KU extended spring break by 1 week in order to allow faculty and instructors to switch to online learning for the rest of the semester. The university also decided that campus would close down except for essential personnel. Soon after the university's announcement, Douglas County, where the KU's main campus in Lawrence is located, issued a shelter-in-place order. The Kansas governor issued a statewide shelter-in-place order the following week. This meant that most library staff were sent home with very little time to prepare to work from home. Our agenda will cover some projects we created for our catalogers and manuscript processors to do from home, and how we pulled data from ArchivesSpace and other resources to create these projects. I will focus on how I pulled data from ArchivesSpace using Microsoft Access for some projects, along with their subsequent workflows. Marcella will share some of the projects she has set up for processing staff and catalogers to work on, along with how she is managing to train and keep track of these projects from afar. The audience level for this presentation includes beginner to advanced material, so hang in there, there's something for everybody. Our practice is to create MARC records in addition to finding aids. This way we provide additional access via our catalog and in OCLC. However, back in late 2004 through 2005, when we were trying to quickly populate our website, we had students copy-paste information found in OCR paper finding aids into a NoteTab Pro template, and then posted them as is. No MARC records were created for these legacy collections. Prior to implementing ArchivesSpace, we created a project for a staff member who was interested in metadata work, which would close the gap between the legacy records that do not have MARC records and the newer finding aids that do. The EADs without MARC records were converted to MARC XML using MARCedit and imported into OCLC. Since LC guidelines were not always used for the name and subject headings on the paper finding aids, these records were going to need a lot of work before they could be produced and added to OCLC. Unfortunately, the staff member left for a different position soon after the project got started, so we moved the project to the someday list. The shelter-in-place order has allowed us to dust off some of those someday projects and to create additional it would be nice if projects. One of these projects is the reemergence of the MARC Records for Legacy Finding Aids project, which can be done from home, and it incorporates a workflow that our cataloger is already used to. And bonus, due to other ArchivesSpace cleanup projects that I'll mention later, the records are in much better shape. So first I had to identify which finding aids need MARC records. If there is a MARC record, it would be in our Voyager catalog with an 856 field to our finding aid. These links correspond to the EAD location field in ArchivesSpace. We use handle.net to manage our URLs, so all of our handles start with http://hdl.handle.net, followed by our unique identifier 10407. I have an ODBC connection to our Voyager database, which allows me to run SQL queries across our data. With this connection, I'm able to use Microsoft Access to find all the 856 fields in Voyager that start with our handle prefix. You can also use ODBC with Excel to run queries. However, I find Access to be more visually friendly because you can easily see all the tables and fields to choose from, and you could see what fields are linked when there are multiple tables being used. The query in Access to find all our MARC records that have an 856 field with our handle prefix required the use of the eLink index table in Voyager. The fields I needed from the table were the record ID field, the record type field, and the link field, and the link text field. The record ID field is the Voyager bib ID. In the record type, I added a criteria of B to narrow the results to just bib records. The link field is the subfield U in the 856 field. This is where I added the criteria for our handle prefix, followed by an asterisk, which is the wildcard character to indicate that there will be additional text after the 10407, and enclose the statement within parentheses so I wouldn't get error messages about using special characters. I also included the link text field, which displays the text found in the delimiter 3 or delimiter Z of the 856 field. As you can see, there were 2,779 records in the results. A handful of these records were for local digital materials rather than finding aids, which were easy to remove based on that link text field. The next step is to get a list of all the EAD locations in ArchivesSpace. Since I already use an ODBC connection and Microsoft Access to create queries in Voyager and Aeon, I had our IT folks ensure that I could connect to our locally hosted ArchivesSpace almost as soon as we installed it via ODBC also. The EAD location information is stored in the resource table. I wanted the results to include the ID field, which is the ArchivesSpace unique identifier for the resource record. This number corresponds to the number in the URL when you have a resource record open. I also want the title field, the identifier field, which in our deployment is the call number, whether the resource record is set to publish or not, the EAD ID, which is the file name that corresponds to our downloaded EADs, and the EAD location, which is the unique handle for the finding aid. Since I only wanted ArchivesSpace records that actually have an EAD location, I set the criteria to not null. The query found 3,657 records that contain information in the EAD location field. To determine which ArchivesSpace records did not have a record in Voyager, I exported the Voyager results from my Voyager database into my ArchivesSpace database. The following screens will illustrate this more fully, but for those who prefer text, I created a query using both tables, linking the EAD location field and the 856 link field. However, the data type for these fields were not the same, so I had to change them to match. Another gotcha is that you will need to use an outer join so that the results will include ArchivesSpace records that did not have a matching Voyager record. To change the data type for the link field in Access, open the table in Design View and then click on the down arrow in the Data Types section next to Link and choose Short Text. The field size on the General tab located in the bottom section will change to 50. I always just change this number to 255, which is the maximum number of characters allowed in a short text field. The image in the top left shows the two tables used in the query. I link the EAD location field to the link field by clicking on the word EAD location and dragging it to the word link. This is an inner join. Any results with this type of join will only give me records where both the ArchivesSpace and Voyager records match. but I want the records that do not match. The image on the top right shows how to get to the Join Properties window by right-clicking on the line that is joining the two fields and then choosing Join Properties. The image in the bottom left is the Join Properties box. At this box, choose the selection that will give you all the records from ArchivesSpace and only those records from Voyager where the fields are equal. In this instance, it's the number 2. The image in the bottom right shows how this changes the join line into a single direction arrow, which indicates an outer join. For the query itself, I want all the ArchivesSpace records that do not match a Voyager record. So if the record ID field from the Voyager table is null, it would mean that there is not a MARC record for the ArchivesSpace record. This is what the results look like when you run the query. There are 1,114 records in ArchivesSpace with a handle that do not have a MARC record in Voyager. At this point, I downloaded the access table as Excel since staff find it less intimidating to work in Excel. The cataloger will use the spreadsheet to search ArchivesSpace for the record and download the record as MARC XML. Yes, we could probably use the data in the spreadsheet and the API to batch download all the records, but ArchivesSpace records are being worked on all the time, so it is likely that by the time the cataloger got around to producing the record in OCLC, the downloaded record could be several months out of date. After downloading 5 to 10 records to work on, the cataloger will open up OCLC and click on File, then choose Import Records. At the Import Records box, click on the Browse button and use Windows Explorer to navigate to the location of the downloaded ArchivesSpace records. We use local save files rather than the online save files, so we switch the destination to local save file. Then you use the local file manager, navigate to the oclc.bib.db file that you want to save your records to. At the Import Records window, click on the Record Characteristics button, and then at the Record Characteristics screen, choose MARC XML, and then click on the OK buttons to close. The MARC XML downloaded from ArchivesSpace only has one 008 field. However, when it is imported into OCLC, an extra 008 field is added. To see it and to be able to delete it, click on View and choose OCLC Fixed Field, and then choose Display as Variable Field. From here, you can delete the extra 008 field or create macros in OCLC to remove extraneous fields like the extra 008 field. We use this OCLC macro to delete the 008, 040, 044, etc. fields. And then after running the delete macro, staff then use constant data to update the fixed fields, add 33x fields, etc. And finally, the cataloger will manually add missing subfield indicators, verify authority headings, add a subject heading if there isn't one on the record, and check for typos and grammar issues. Anything they fix in the MARC record will also need to be updated in the ArchivesSpace record. Once they are satisfied that the record is complete, they update holdings to create MARC records in OCLC, then export the record into Voyager. Like others, we have a few agent and subject record cleanup projects. Some of them are ongoing and some we were able to start during this time. Some ongoing or completed projects related to agent and subject records include finding agent and subject records that are not linked to a resource, a session, or digital object record. I usually run this every 2 or 3 months. In 2017, I created a report to list all of our subject headings, which were then reviewed and updated to follow Library of Congress subject heading standards. And then prior to upgrading ArchivesSpace to the version that introduced the Compare Agents functionality, I ran queries to pull all of our personal name, corporate, and family name records to identify duplicates and missed tags, because the new agent merge functionality was going to remove the ability to merge multiple records at the same time, and it was going to prevent the merging of agent records of different types. We cleaned up those issues and left the remaining records for someday. This is the query I use to find subject records not linked to an accession resource or digital object record. You'd use the subject and subject relationship table in Access. Link the ID field in the subject table to the subject ID field in the subject relationship table. This type of join will retrieve all subjects that have a relationship with an accession resource or digital object record. Since we want the records that do not actually have a relationship, you would change this to an outer join. Decide what fields you will need from these two tables and drag them to the bottom section. I chose ID, title, and subject ID. Title is the heading, not the actual title of the resource. This will give you a report of all the subject headings that are not linked to a record. And here's the resulting list. To process, search by the term or the ID to find the subject record. Look at the linked records section in view mode. If it says no records found, then it was okay to delete the record. This example is a little more complex. If you search the heading African Americans, Kansas, Ottawa, the linked records section has a resource record listed. So what's going on? Is the query incorrect? If you view the resource record, you'll see that the heading African Americans, Kansas, Ottawa photographs is used in the record. So what we have is two headings, one with the further subdivision photographs, which is used on a record, and the one without the further subdivision, which is not used on a record. It is okay to delete the one without the photographs subdivision. The query to find personal names that aren't linked to a similar The query to find personal names that aren't linked is similar to the subject heading query. However, you'll notice that all of your staff users will also be listed in this report since ArchivesSpace creates an agent record for them. You could run an additional query with your results and the user table to eliminate your users from your results if desired. For the main query, use the name person and linked agents relationships table. Use an outer join just like you did in the subjects query. Add fields from the name person table that you may need, for example, primary name, rest of name, etc. There are two fields you will have to have. The ID field from the linked agents relationship table with the criteria set to is null, and the authorized field from the name person table with the criteria set to 1, so that you extract only the authorized heading and not all the variants. If you run the second query to remove ArchivesSpace users, use the table you just created and the user table. Create an outer join link between the agent person ID and the agent record ID field. Include all the fields from the table you created and the username field from the user table. The criteria will be null in the username field to get the personal name records that don't have a username in ArchivesSpace. So the first query when I ran it had 73 entries, and after eliminating the staff users with the second query, I was down to 20 names. I'm including the query I used to get a list of all of our subject headings, even though we completed this work in 2017. Use the subject table, and at the very least, you want the title field, which is the subject heading. I also included the authority ID and ID fields. The image on the right is the result of the query. Best practice in ArchivesSpace is to have each term in a subject heading listed separately. If you look carefully, you can tell which headings will have the subject term in a single field versus the ones that will have the subdivisions in separate fields. If there's a space before and after the double dash, it is in multiple fields. No space, then it is in a single field. Remember that I said I prefer Microsoft Access because it's more visually appealing? Well, here is the SQL for my query to pull a list of all of our personal name headings in ArchivesSpace. This is the same query in design view, still complex, but a little easier to understand. This query is more complex because I wanted additional information that wasn't in the name person table. I wanted to include the authority ID if it was in the agent record, which is only available in the name authority ID table. To see if the agent record was published or not, I had to link in the agent person table. I also wanted to know which records had a contact name, so I brought in the agent contact table. And finally, I wanted to know the source and rules values, for example, local or RDA, etc. The name person table uses a numerical value for these fields, but if you want a translation of what these values mean, you need to link to the enumeration value table. The lines between the tables indicate which fields are linked and which are outer joins. These are the fields I selected from my query results. The table names where the field comes from is in that second line. And in the first and third group, you'll see where I renamed the value fields to be contact name, source, and rules, followed by a colon. This way I could easily tell them apart in my results. The only criteria is a 1 under authorized, so that the results are only the authorized forms from the ArchivesSpace and not all the variant forms of name. If you want to report with the variants, leave this field blank. And this is what my results look like. When we left to work from home, we had no idea how long we would be in this situation, and we still really don't. So I wanted to make sure that the most egregious errors were worked on first. The most problematic records are those generated when we ingested our EADs. The agent records have the entire name, dates, qualifiers, etc. in that primary name field. To find these, I exported the access table to Excel and then filtered the rest of the names, columns, date columns, etc. to be blank. The second priority was any remaining records that have a source of ingest. These were primarily donor records. And then last priority is everything else. This category of records are newer to ArchivesSpace and are likely to be set up correctly. We usually have catalogers rather than manuscript processors set up the agent and subject records, so this project is being worked on by one of our catalogers who works in Spencer. She will merge any remaining duplicates and fix mistags. Since we have all of LC's authority file plus locally created authority headings in Voyager, she'll search there first. If there is an LC authority record, she uses the LC NAF plugin to import the records and merges the existing ArchivesSpace record with it. If the record is not in LC's catalog, she establishes the name using RDA guidelines. And finally, it would be nice if project. Marcella wanted a list of all of our records that have a separated or related materials note so that she could work on a project to merge finding aids. Unfortunately, you can't use Microsoft Access to query note fields. However, I do have all of our published resource records downloaded as EAD in our Git repository. Using Notepad++, I was able to search across all of our EADs and get a list of all of our records with a separated or related materials note. I then used this information and Microsoft Access to create a spreadsheet with additional information from ArchivesSpace. So this is a copy of our Git repository on my desktop computer. Using Notepad++'s Find in Files function, I did a search for angle bracket separated, and then another one for angle bracket related, and then these are the results, which includes the file name. If you remove the C users M Kottman documents KSRL EAD portion at the beginning of the file name and the .xml portion at the end of the file name, you have the EAD ID that is found in ArchivesSpace. So I copied the results into Excel and did a little massaging to end up with a list of file names. I copied the list of file names and otherwise known as EAD IDs to Notepad and imported this text file into Microsoft Access ArchivesSpace database. Using the just imported table and the resource table with an inner join link from the file name to the EAD ID field, I then selected whatever fields I wanted from the resource and moved those to the bottom and then ran the query. These are the results which I exported into Excel and shipped off to Marcella.
Okay, so I'll take over as soon as I share my screen. There we go. All right. So since Malaka just finished talking about the query she ran to find me collections of separated or related materials notes, I'll start there. So back in the early 2000s, when Spencer Research Library staff started creating EAD finding aids, they made a few decisions to expedite getting these finding aids online quickly. One of these decisions was to create collection level EADs and leave the rest of the inventory as a scanned PDFs from original typed inventories. I'll get back to that in a moment. Another was to create EADs with a 1-to-1 ratio per call number. Spencer typically assigns call number by size and format. So oversized materials needing flat housing or photographs or audio-visual materials or volumes that cannot comfortably sit in boxes, all of those have gotten different call numbers from textual materials that fit in standard document cases and cubic foot boxes. Our original history collection in particular seemed for a while there to just like to create new call numbers for the sheer joy of it. So this often means that a collection has 2 or more call numbers. Rather than creating a finding aid for the entire collection, staff and student assistants were creating EADs for each individual call number. Finding aid encoders, at least those working in the original history collection, typically included a separated materials note for the other call numbers that were part of the collection. Creating separate finding aids like this can be misleading to researchers as well as confusing. Researchers might not realize that a collection has been broken out into multiple parts, and they might miss pieces that they otherwise would have been interested in reviewing. At the same time, when creating these early EADs, encoders sometimes either missed call numbers, so they did not create a finding aid, or they did not include them as standard practice. For example, I think photographs were going to be described in a separate project, or there was an expectation that people would just go to the paper binders about the photograph collections. We've therefore wanted to reconsolidate these finding aids for a while. So while working on this project, I've used several clues that are pretty standardized in Spencer's finding aids to figure out which EADs should be consolidated, which should remain separate. File names are often a first clue about whether or not resources should be consolidated. Our EAD file name structure is based off the creator or subject of the collection. If there are several finding aids with file names based on the Lawrence, Kansas City Clerk's Office, or several related to the East India Company, particularly having the same base call number there of MS97, I'm immediately suspicious that those really should be a single resource record. File names are not sufficient though. The finding aid itself gives me a lot of clues about whether or not these resource records should be consolidated. Oftentimes there's a separated materials note, how the project got started, as Malaka just talked about. In conjunction with that, the immediate source of acquisition note often provides me sufficient provenance information to be confident that the materials at the different call numbers all came from the same source. The other thing that often comes up, especially in our special collections, is all of the materials were purchased from various dealers or vendors, or it was a collection that was artificially created by Spencer Research Library staff. In those kinds of situations, again, I'm pretty confident about reconsolidating as a single finding aid. The example here on the screen has a separated materials note on each finding aid, but the immediate source of acquisition notes don't provide a whole lot of information, unfortunately, and they don't match. Frequently, the immediate source of acquisition note will be exactly the same for each of the resource records. For example, gift, Charles Bamfield, 1972. In situations like the one on the screen, I'll typically check on the accession file when I'm in the office. I do occasionally have access to the building while we're still completely shut down. In this case, the accession file did indeed confirm that staff intended that all these materials at these different call numbers should be treated as a single collection. And I say all because there were, in fact, other finding aids that had not been converted to EAD. Sometimes, either because I don't have access to the accession file or because even the accession file is not providing me enough information, I'll leave a note for later in ArchivesSpace. That processing plan field is your friend, folks. When consolidating multiple resource records, I typically choose the one to keep that has the most information in it already. I review all the different collection level fields to make sure they include everything from the different resource records. And this includes adding subjects and agents from the other resource records or occasionally removing subjects or agents if they lose significance in the context of the entire collection, as well as adding physical location notes for each call number. I remove the separated materials note unless there really is material that's still in fact physically separated because it's a publication, because it was transferred to the art museum, or for some other reason. And then I will add the inventories for the other call numbers at the archival object level. I will often do this manually rather than using ArchivesSpace's merge function because I'm cleaning up data in the archival objects anyway, or because I'm transferring what was a single volume or other single item resource record. If a staff person has already cleaned up the resource record that I'm merging from, then I'm more likely to use that functionality within the system. And when I say cleanup, I'm talking about things like updating the date section to use the begin-end functionality. Our dates always migrated just into the expression field when they came into ArchivesSpace, adding container profiles to top containers and that kind of thing. I then review the newly whole finding aid and set it to republish. I'll also check Voyager to see if anybody has yet created a MARC record for the collection. Oftentimes, I think in the project that Malaka spoke about earlier, a cataloger created brief bid records for each individual call number, mirroring what had happened with the EADs. So I'll consolidate those brief bid records before asking our cataloging staff to enhance the record when making an OCLC record. So that last project might be unique to Spencer's legacy processes. The other projects that I want to talk about today are probably more common for a variety of repositories. Like I mentioned briefly, Spencer staff used scanned PDFs for inventories and attached them to stub collection level records, rather than converting those to EAD when first putting finding aids online. Our fabulous IT staff have managed just in the past 5 years to make our PDFs keyword searchable, so that if you were looking for a particular term, those results would appear in our XTF search interface. However, we are in the midst of migrating from our old, outdated XTF server to using the ArchivesSpace public user interface, which does not search PDF inventories, even if the PDFs are still searchable once you open them. Because of this, and because it's preferable to have all the data about a collection centralized as much as possible into our collections management system, it was a low-level priority for us to convert as many of these PDFs as possible to be inventories. We would occasionally go in and fix these issues on an ad hoc basis if we were going in and fixing other things about a finding aid, especially if the PDF was really short and really easy to figure out. But neither this nor the separated materials project were focused, planned projects until the pandemic. This project is currently focused only on our regional history collecting area. Inventories for this area are usually really straightforward and contain only folder title and number information. Special collections also has a lot of PDFs, but these PDFs tend to have a lot of complex item level detail based on the involved calendaring processing that the special collections manuscripts processor did from the 1960s to the 1990s. And these PDFs also usually require a lot more translation and mapping for where to put information. That means as and when we start inputting that information into ArchivesSpace, it will only be worked on by experienced manuscripts processing staff. I'll mention that university archives, both official records and personal papers from faculty, were typically minimally processed and only described at the box level, so we don't really have any PDFs to convert from that collecting area. There's also some PDFs that will remain associated with collections simply because they are not inventories and they don't translate well into ArchivesSpace. Family trees is the first example that I can think of. But because the regional history PDF inventories are usually straightforward, this project provided an opportunity to give some of our cataloging staff a project to work on from home, particularly staff who otherwise would have had nothing to work on. The managers in the department asked their staff who would be interested and who otherwise had little to work on, and we added 2 staff members to this project, both of whom had experience as students working in special collections, so dealing with archival collections rather than published items wouldn't be totally new for them. Thankfully, we have a pretty robust set of manuals for manuscripts processing, including specifically for how we use and populate our ArchivesSpace repository. I was able to copy and paste large sections of the existing manual to a new document and add information specifically about working with the PDFs for those cataloging staff who had never worked in ArchivesSpace. I focused on those sections of the manual that would affect these staff members' work. Since they wouldn't be creating new resource records or working at the resource level, only creating inventories, I didn't include that information in order to lessen fatigue from learning a whole bunch of new stuff at once. Also, working with cataloging staff who are used to working in large, complex databases, I had more confidence about training these staff members over Zoom than I would have trying to teach a student the same information, training that I typically perform in person with students. I conducted a 90-minute long Zoom training session with them, sharing screens so that they could see the process in action and give it a brief try for themselves. And of course, I gave them the manuals before we did the training, so they were able to read through beforehand. Like I said, this project, at least in this first round, is focused on straightforward box folder inventories. I've given each staff member a spreadsheet with around 20 collections having PDF inventories. Their spreadsheets include a column for questions or oddities so that they can relay this information back to me to include in the master project spreadsheet for any outstanding issues that can't be addressed at this time. My master spreadsheet includes some additional collection resource records with PDF inventories so that when staff complete this first round, I can hand off additional projects. I have notes to myself in the master spreadsheet about whether or not it's a good project for somebody to work on from home. And this includes identifying specific staff, or at least indicating this really needs to be done by a manuscripts processor who knows the quirks of our collections, rather than a cataloger who isn't as familiar with them. Some of the PDFs are more confusing or questionable without, again, having the box of stuff in front of you to look at and figure out what's going on physically. Because we've been cleaning up our ArchivesSpace resource records since we first began migrating from EAD around 2014-2015, a lot of the records that staff are adding inventories to might have had some interim cleanup already completed. We've had several different phased cleanup projects over the years to enhance our EADs and prepare our resource records to be publicly available through the ArchivesSpace public user interface. We've chosen to do this work on a phased basis over time because nobody has worked solely on cleanup, only as time permits, so that we could continue processing new collections. In this example, you can see the collection description in the top image on this slide is showing both the other finding aids note pointing to PDFs, as well as 2 summary containers. We've been adding container information so that we can use the ArchivesSpace Aeon integration to help researchers request materials directly from the ArchivesSpace PUI. In cases like this, before we got the inventory added to this collection, researchers would have had to manually go in if they only wanted to see box 3 from the first series of photos, for example. At the same time, doing these cleanup projects, we're able to clarify and correct information in our finding aids, such as rediscovering that the first series in this collection is really a wide variety of stereo views, not just views created by Alexander Gardner. Copying and pasting from our PDFs is not always the easiest thing to do. We're dealing with typed inventories from the mid-20th century a lot of the time, and as you have all probably experienced for yourselves, OCRing these documents does not always get quite the right character translation. Staff have to pay attention and proofread as they work through inventories and make fixes along the way. And I'll just point out that having 2 monitors available to work on these kinds of projects is really, really useful if possible. Staff can either use rapid data entry mode or the Harvard plugin for spreadsheet uploads to add box and folder information, depending on their comfort in ArchivesSpace and familiarity with the Harvard spreadsheets. For some other data entry projects that are not involving departmental staff, I also have a simplified spreadsheet template that I provide. And then I copy and paste that information into the Harvard spreadsheet for upload. That allows for a little additional quality control before getting it into ArchivesSpace. And it also is way less overwhelming for staff who are not used to working in ArchivesSpace, not to have every single column there and not to have to figure out how do I hide these columns and all of that. Because we're moving from a paper-based system to adding data to a modular database system, sometimes staff have to make decisions about how to translate the data. For the collection in the top image, the processor followed the PDF inventories and created subseries for each legislative year within the legislative file series, because of the way information was presented in the PDF. In another situation, which you can see in the below image PDF, we added the year information at every single file, which had just been at the box level, and we therefore created fewer subseries. I'm mentioning this because I suggest that you go for internal consistency within each collection, not necessarily worrying about consistency across an entire repository on projects like this. Depending on how many staff you have working on a project, how familiar they are with ArchivesSpace or working in spreadsheets, not to mention how each collection was originally processed in the first place, internal consistency is going to be a lot easier to maintain. Also, as I'm sure we've all seen in our work, how you approach a project changes over time. And it's a lot easier to fix or revise a single resource record and its archival objects rather than several resource records if halfway through you realize, oh, this is how I should have been doing it all along. As with consolidating separate resource records, staff add a revision statement to indicate they've converted the PDF inventory to be part of the resource record. We delete the other finding aids note since we no longer need it, and staff email me so I can conduct a final review of the revised resource record. I check to make sure all information got moved over to the new archival objects and do a final proofing for any OCR mishaps or to make sure moved over correctly. It can be really easy to get into a groove and not realize that, hey, you should have switched over to box 148 from 147 and that didn't happen. I then republish the entire record and let Malaka know that we're no longer using some of these PDFs or that we've had to revise the PDFs because, for example, it's now just a family tree and not also the inventory. I have one last project that I want to talk about today, another one that we've worked on a little bit here and there, but that the pandemic will allow us to focus on more, depending on how much time we all have to work from home. Like every repository, we have a lot of process collections that don't necessarily have online finding aids, because they were processed well before the internet was commonly used, let alone existed. We have a lot of very tiny collections in both our special collections and regional history collecting areas. Collections that are a single folder or just a handful of folders, not enough to fill even a slim document case. For our regional history collection, a lot of these tiny collections are photo collections, so they've got some real rich visual appeal for researchers. Our accessions coordinator, who mostly works with the regional history collection, has over the past few years figured out which collections were still missing finding aids and compiling accession information when it's been easily findable into one physical place in my working area. This basically means I have a lot of boxes full of a lot of folders. The reason that she did that, we both thought I could give new students some of these small projects to get them more familiar in ArchivesSpace, or give them to any processor in need of something quick and small to work on between larger projects. In practice, I haven't really used them that way yet, but it did mean that in the 2 days I was in Spencer before campus shut down, I had immediate access to these accession files and could quickly scan several of these paper documents to our central networked file storage. So this is an example of one of these small photo accession files, the accession record on the left-hand side. I'm just showing the accession worksheet here, but in this particular case, there was actually a little more info in the file. Letters from our staff to the donor providing a little more information about how we acquired the collection. In some instances, there's been a news clipping or other descriptive info about the collection not included on the accession worksheet. But typically, all we have is this one page. I scanned all of these files to the shared network storage and have them saved by their main call number, or the identifier, and the collection title. These are all in a single folder of pandemic accessions to make it easier for me to find when handing out projects. Like the PDF conversion project, I'm divvying these out in spreadsheets to individual staff members in blocks of 20 or so, and I'll probably be able to scan more at some point when I'm back in the building with more frequency, in case we need more at-home projects. When I was scanning these records, if I could not quickly figure out what was going on with the collection, the accession worksheet mentioned something at another call number, or that a piece of the collection still hadn't been processed, I did not scan the accession file because I figured that would be something we would just have to deal with on site. I was trying to keep this project as simple as possible, both for me and for staff who would be working on it. The accession worksheet on the previous slide actually had some pretty good descriptive data about what was in it, which we were able to translate into archival objects as shown in the screenshot from the staff interface on this slide. Some of the worksheets don't provide that much information, so we're guessing about the physicality of the collection, assuming that it's one folder per one photographic print, for example, based on general past practice when processing photographs. That's something that we can go back and figure out later when we're back in the building as needed, and is honestly probably something that won't happen until a researcher requests the collection and somebody in public services says, hey, this is only one folder instead of 3, or something like that. This project is also helping to generate work for our cataloging staff. As we create new resource records, few or none of them had even a brief bibliographic record in our Voyager system. I've also told staff working on this project to get creative and feel free to do some research. In the case of this collection, staff could use various genealogical databases and findengrave.com to try to find out more information about our teacher, Helen Perry, the donor and compiler of this collection. I wanted to give staff a project that could be both fairly rote, pretty easy to handle, but also give them some decision-making, depending on what kind of structure they needed and what kind of mental capacity they had, how stressed out they were by being in a pandemic. Biographical historical notes have not been required fields at Spencer. They're not required in DAX, but I try to require them whenever possible because they give greater context to a collection. So I've been talking about spreadsheets and shared network storage and other relatively low-tech ways I've been managing these projects after Miloche has been able to generate the reports. And I want to take just a minute or two to go into a little more detail about that. I have a master spreadsheet that I use to track our normal manuscripts processing projects. I've used that spreadsheet to track some other legacy projects as well that folks were working on in office. But for this, I created a separate master spreadsheet for tracking all pandemic-related projects that I am overseeing in ArchivesSpace. This does not include some of the projects that Malaka described earlier, which cataloging staff are tracking separately. It seemed the best way to do it to me back in March because it's essentially a whole lot of little special projects within a large special project. Also because we're in a situation where we can't just get up from our desk and run to the stacks to check what's going on with one of these legacy collections, I wanted to capture all information in a centralized location for when we are back in the building, to figure out what needs to be done that we couldn't do from home. So here's a screenshot of one tab from this master spreadsheet of work from home projects. For all of our at-home projects that I've been assigning folks, I update this to indicate which resource records have been worked on so far, and if there are any outstanding issues. These columns are pretty much the same across all pandemic projects. The outstanding issues column is probably the most important in all of these projects because almost invariably there is something that somebody will need to physically check in the stacks before we can actually truly say we are done. That said, the most common issue I've seen so far is that we don't have OCLC records at the collection level for a lot of these legacy manuscript collections, even the ones that did already have finding aids. which that was one of the projects that Malaka talked about. So that's all that Malaka and I have. What questions do we have?
Thank you. Thank you, Malaka. Thank you, Marcella. That was really great. We are going to go ahead and open the floor up to questions. Again, we do ask that you type your questions into the Q&A option at the bottom. That will allow people to comment on each other's questions and get some threads going. And this will actually be the copy of the questions that will be provided with the recording. So to that end, we are recording this, and the recording will be made available at the end of the webinar with Malaka and Marcella's slides. So with that, we'll go ahead and move into the Q&A. We do have a good question here from Doug asking, what is the value or benefit of deleting subject and agent records that may have future use when you return to work on campus?
Did you want to answer that first, Marcella?
Sure. So for a lot of the subjects and agents that are being deleted, they are part of the cleanup process where I would say they probably aren't going to show up again. They were very unique to that one particular collection, and or they were just wrong. The regional history collection and special collections both tended to do subjects of 1800 to 1900, or names that, you know, we have the actual approved heading, let's use that instead. Do you want to add to that, Malaka?
Oh yeah. There's also ArchivesSpace has authority control similar to Voyager, actually, where it's stagnant, and so it's not constantly updated. But as we know, LC's authority files are updated daily, weekly. And so this way you don't have to maintain headings that aren't actually used on materials.
And they're easy enough to add back if there was one that, oh, we will be using this one again.
Yeah, and it'll be updated to the most current form at that time.
Right.
Thanks. We have another question. Would you be willing to share your processing manual?
Yeah, Joan, if you want to email me at my email message that's on the screen, feel free.
And I will add to that, especially if you do have maybe people that don't necessarily work in ArchivesSpace or now doing ArchivesSpace or ArchivesSpace adjacent work right now, be sure if you're from an ArchivesSpace member institution to encourage them to sign up for Help Center accounts. There, our user manual is in the Help Center, but also there are some really useful tutorial videos that are in small digestible chunks that can help them as they're doing this unfamiliar work. All right, we've got another question in the chat from Anna. Do you expect to complete these cleanup projects while working from home? If not, what are you doing to get buy-in to continue this work once everyone is back in the office?
Well, I'd say that some of these projects, they were already sort of in process. It's just that now they are all we are working on.
Yeah, the agent cleanup process, the first priority records, last week, going in alphabetical order, she was in the R's for the first priority. The second priority records are already done because they were done by another person. So really, we just have the third priority stuff and the tail end of the first priority left to do. So then we'll be done. Yay! The MARC record legacy cleanup project, I think, impacts so many other workflows that I will probably continue doing that. Maybe not necessarily with the current cataloger that's doing it, I might introduce it to other catalogers actually in the cataloging department across the street from Spencer, since they don't have to do a lot of work in ArchivesSpace to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, we've been at home for 2.5 months now.
Yeah.
I mean, the PDF conversion project, it's gonna take a lot of time. And we're also concerned about, we are phased reopening, so people are probably going to continue working from home at least part of the time for a while. So this is just work that can remain available as needed.
Another question. Have you been able to continue any of the work that would normally happen if you were still working at Spencer? Question from a former Jayhawk, by the way.
Not really. There might be some urgent work where something was in process that was being bought. So we're getting in the records that we need in order to say, yes, we have bought this item. But general manuscripts processing halted the day that we left Spencer. I've told staff, whatever they were working on, if they can get access to the building, go ahead and make notes to themselves to figure out what they were doing so that when they can get back in on a regular basis, they can get back to working on those projects.
Thanks. Another question, and if anyone attending has experience with this, please feel free to type an answer as well. Have you experimented with converting PDFs to Word and then maybe importing them into Excel from that?
Very little. I think maybe with 1 or 2 projects, but not too frequently. And honestly, I could see doing it depending on how well formatted the PDF is. But for the most part, it's been pretty easy to just throw it into either rapid data entry or directly into a spreadsheet.
Yeah, and I can't remember that open source product that Jameen mentioned, but we considered that, what was like Tableau, I don't know, something that started with a tab.
Yeah.
Which would work and it looked easy, but the PDFs we're working from need the human interpretation to figure out where things are going, so it's not a straight one-to-one, even if we had it converted into Excel, which is what that program would have done.
Yeah, and I think the other issue with that particular program was it was having the same OCR issues where it couldn't read the text properly.
Yeah.
Thanks. And then Jessica has chimed in on that saying, I've used Notepad++ to convert to Excel, then to EAD at the University of Nevada, Reno.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we don't have any other open questions, so I'm going to talk very slowly. If anyone does have a final question, go ahead and type it into the chat. But otherwise, thank you everyone for attending this webinar, and thank you to Miloche and Marcella, who have included their email addresses on the slide, so feel free to reach out to them. Sorry I volunteered you for that.
We did it to ourselves.
And the recording and presentation slides will be made available on our YouTube channel and on the ArchivesSpace website soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.